We're going to read 7 short poems, and we'll get to that in just a moment. I just wanted to add to Omer's comments that, you know, what he's been doing with Deuxmers Publishing over the last years here in Hawaii and around the world is really extraordinary, because Omer is so passionate that it's very difficult for a writer to come to a publisher and leave and then realize that the publisher was more passionate than you were. You know, you usually expect the other way around. You expect it's going to be your biggest problem. But he's also extremely businesslike and organized. He understands the aesthetic, but he understands the discipline of producing something in a way that's not only professionally crafted, but that's meaningful, because it has the appropriate pedigree of respect for the medium that it's addressing. And in this case, these Turkish poems, as much as I would like to be publishing, as much as I have poems published, and as much as I would like to believe that I'm fairly well versed with the canon of poetry over a number of centuries, Omer brought me a couple of years ago this English translation by someone else of some of the poems of the Second New. And I just was stopped cold in my tracks. I thought, who are these people? Who are these guys? It was in this case happened to be mostly men at that time in Istanbul. And he mentioned, particularly in the 1940s and the 50s and the 60s, some of the ones that I read were astonishing, but I didn't particularly like the translation, the English interpretation. And I went to him and said, look, you're the Turkish expert, not me at all. What do you think of this? And you know, the guy's professor at so-and-so university, whatever. And I said, nonsense, you understand the aesthetic here, spiritually, soulfully, you know, and he had been thinking about doing translation. So this energy was really, you know, sort of cross-viral in this way. And he went and disappeared for months on this, and finally called me one day and said, I've got a bunch of these poems I translated, and they're short, they're crisp, they're to the point. And in an age where there's, you know, poetry is really tricky, because a lot of people come up and always say, I want to learn more, but I don't really understand it. And you know, we usually say, don't try and think of the meaning as much, just feel it. It's like a piece of music, okay? It's just, it's not good or bad. It's all relative to just your own visceral reaction. Well, what really knocked me out about these guys is that in an age of very polished, highly produced books of poetry, even down to the covers, the font, the art, and everything else, these guys just hammered at a time where they were sitting in these go home and Google this, they're in these Istanbul cafes, sitting in the 50s in these basement cafes, and there'll be 15 of these guys at a table looking down at the photographer. Everybody's got a cigarette with an ash this long. You know you have a real core poet when he can smoke a cigarette, recite the poem, and the ash still didn't fall off the cigarette. I don't know how they do that. But these guys, it's the real deal, okay? They're so truthful, it's so raw, it's so visceral, it's so apolitical in a hyper-political age right now. For us, everything is on the left or the right, or everything relates to either a political, socio-political spectrum, or gender politics, or whatever the case may be. And this was a different time, but they were not interested in any of that. They bared their souls. They're very, very direct. They surrender to the reader. It's very intimate, and then it's over, and you just say to yourself, what happened? So I hope you'll feel that. Finally, I just wanted to mention that Omer had incredible support of 2 really significant people in the world of poetry for this book, who endorsed and supported this book. And they made comments that are on the back cover. And one is Willis Barnstone, who's one of the great translation authorities in the world on poetry internationally. And the other was Ed Hirsch. If you know Edward Hirsch, he's one of the great American poets. He's also the president of the Guggenheim Foundation in New York City. And he's very, very close with a friend of some of ours, Frank, and other people in the audience, William Merwin, W.S. Merwin, the poet, in Maui. So there's the fact that this attracted their attention, and that Omer has that support for Deuxmers says something about the quality work that he's executing. So I'm really proud to be able to work with him on this. Anyway, today, what we're going to do is, normally what happens in a cross-translated reading, you may know, is that you read it in the original tongue first, and then the other person reads it in English. But we decided we're going to reverse that, because almost none of us speak Turkish. So this way, from my end, you'll get the context of what's being said, and then Omer will read it in the Turkish with his own interpretation, and you'll feel, hopefully you'll feel the melody, the rhythm, the spirit, and the soul of in the original tongue as these poets read. So without any further ado, we'll get going, and let's get right into the first one. Tonight, if we do this half decently, then we hope that you'll be hearing their voices, which may have been silent otherwise for several decades. Here's the very first poem. And this poem is called If I Come By Now. If I come by now, you've bathed, combed your hair, droplets on your forehead, a lightness, a grace in your face, like the stars after a mist. Your fingertips have turned pink. You're sprawled on the bed. I wrote this as a love song, my bride. Rain is now falling on the roads, on the leaves. If I come by, you are home, together with all the warmth, your bosom covered, your lips apart. If you would breathe upon and warm my hands. But where are you now?
Şimdi gelsem ki, by Turgut Uyar, right? Oh yeah, got it. Şimdi gelsem ki sen yıkanmışsın, saçlarını taramışsın, alnından mini mini damlalar, bir hafiflik, bir incelik yüzünde, bu ardından yıldızlar gibi, parmak uçların pembeleşmiş, sere serpe yatağa uzanmışsın. Bunu sevda türküsü olsun diye yazdım gelinim. Şimdi yağmur yağıyor yollara, yapraklara. Gelsem ki sen evdesin, cümle sıcaklıklarla berabersin. Göğsün kapalı, dudakların aralık, ellerimi hoplayıp hoplayıp ısıtsam. Halbuki şimdi sen nerelerdesin?
The second poem is entitled Count by Jamal Soroya. We sat under the moonlight. I kissed your ankles. Then I kissed you standing. I kissed you on the lips. I kissed you at the doorway. I kissed your breath. There were kids in the garden. I kissed your child. I took you home in my bed. I kissed your sex. We ran into each other elsewhere. I kissed you within. In the end, I took you out. I kissed you at your source.
Siz Cemal Şuraya çıkar. Sayın, ay ışığında oturuyorduk, bileğinden öptüm seni. Sonra ayakta öptüm, dudağından öptüm seni. Kapı aralığında öptüm, soluğundan öptüm seni. Bahçede çocuklar vardı, çocuğundan öptüm seni. Evime götürdüm, yatağında, kasığından öptüm seni. Başka evlerde karşılaştık, iliğinden öptüm seni. En sonunda caddelere çıkardım, kaynağından öptüm seni.
The next poem is also by Jamal Soroya, and it's called At the Afyon Train Station. Remember the little girl at the Afyon train station? You know, she'd removed her shoes as she boarded the train. Recall the Varto earthquake, the carton of powdered milk, and the bra sent as aid from the West. The man had whitewashed his walls with the milk powder. His wife had kept the bra, not knowing what it was. She was going to use them as earmuffs in winter. My God, were these really your childhood days? Crowds sitting outside on doorsteps. I wish I loved you only for this.
Afyon Garı'ndaki küçük kızı anımsa, hani trene binerken pabuçlarını çıkartmıştı. Varto depremini düşün, yardım olarak batıdan gönderilmiş bir kutu süt tozunu ve sütyeni. Adam süt tozuyla evinin duvarlarını badana etmişti. Karısıysa saklamıştı ne olduğunu bilmediği sütyeni. Kulaklık olarak kullanmayı düşünüyordu onu kışın. Tanrım, gerçekten çocukluk günlerinizde mi? Eşiklere oturmuş bir dolu insan, keşke yalnız bunun için sevseydim seni.
The next poem is also by Jamal Soroya, and Keep the Change, which is the eponymous title of the book, as Omar mentioned earlier.
And this one. In
Right,
Turkish.
no. Keep the change. I'm dying, dear God. This too happened. Every death is an early death. I know, dear God. But yet, This life you take is not so bad. Keep the change.
Üstü kalsın. Ölüyorum Tanrım. Bu da oldu işte. Her ölüm erken ölümdür. Biliyorum Tanrım. Ama ayrıca aldığın şu hayat fena değildir. Üstü kalsın.
Next poem is entitled Is It Spring by Turgut Uyar. I said if it was spring, upon seeing the basil bloom suddenly, in undeniable eternity, hand in hand with heartbreaking feelings. Winter, winter of course, or no, or fall, and that to lovers. But if you ask me, it's like the summer sweat on a child that dries and fades away.
İlk yaz mı? İlk yaz mı dedim rastgele, atlayan fesleğenleri görünce. Sonsuzdur kesin, yürek delen duygularla el ele. Kış, kış elbette. Ya da öyle, ya güz. Onu sevdalılara sor. Ama bana kalırsa bir çocuğun yaz teri gibidir. Kurur, geçer, gider. Almost done. Picked on by this girl, İlham Berk. This. Let's do this.
Nightfall and a stalk of basil. Someone has called on me, he said. Who could it be? When he saw the stalk of basil stuck in the door, pushed open the door, he'd fastened with a rope, looked around. 3 more leaves had fallen from the vine, 3 dry leaves. He saw the cracked pomegranates, as if for the first time, dropped off the onions and the salt in the kitchen. It got dark, he said, later when he entered the room. He changed his clothes, filled the lamp with oil, threw some wood in the oven, lit it. Sounds were coming from the neighbors. Were they frying fish? He then sat down with the evening and the stalk of basil in his hand.
I don't need to read the Turkish for this. So that's it, just a little sampling. And I must say that, I should have said that earlier too, this is just a tiny, tiny slice. I mean, these are just some of them, you know. I would need like, I don't know, 18 years or something to translate all of them. So it's about 1.5 years, 2 years of work. So it's just a tiny slice. I was going to suggest as a joke before we finish that maybe I'll read the English, you read the Turkish.
That's not really
Let's not do that. Let's not
Let's not do that.
No.